Welcome back to another video lecture. We're glad that you pressed the button and that hopefully you're going to learn something. So we're going to kind of expand a little bit and that's not right. Take two. Welcome back. Welcome back to another United States history lecture designed to help you pass your tests because you probably weren't paying attention that well in class, and that's okay. This lecture is kind of going to be devoted to Vietnam. So, believe it or not, we're going to do Vietnam in 10 minutes. Actually, about 9.5 at this point, right? So, what do you have to know for Vietnam? I'm going to try to cover the multiple choice kind of questions first, and then hopefully, I think you'd have enough to belt out a thematic essay. And I definitely would recommend maybe reading a book. I think is it the things that they carried, the things that we've carried. There's tons of great movies, great books on Vietnam, and I would certainly seek out that and expand your horizons a little bit. But let's kind of give you the nitty-gritty, what you need. Vietnam technically is never a war, so that's number one. I've seen that question a lot. We should just call it the Vietnam conflict. I'm going to try to say that the best that I can. Because remember, constitutionally, in order to have a war, Congress has to declare a war. So like World War II, you know, when Pearl Harbor occurred, Congress declares war. That event never occurred in Vietnam. But let's give you kind of the beginning and then see what we can do with the end. The beginnings really trace back to the mid-50s. Really, 4 United States presidents were involved with Vietnam. First, Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican from the 1950s, a believer in something called the domino theory, that, remember, our major policy for communism is containment. Right? Not to eliminate communism, you can't do that. Nuclear weapons, World War III. But our policy is to contain it, to act when it grows. Almost like a fire. You know, as soon as the fire starts spreading, you have to put the fire out before the fire burns down the whole house. So we've seen early containment episodes in Europe, like the Berlin blockade, which led to the Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan for economic poverty in Western Europe, the Truman Doctrine being put in place in Greece and Turkey to arm those countries against communist aggression. And then after, or even before Vietnam, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Western Hemisphere. All of these are kind of like little episodes in the chess game. But Vietnam is probably the biggest move. So in the early 1950s, the mid-1950s, as the French were defeated in Vietnam, that's a really important fact. The French colonized Vietnam. So I think that if we see it from the Vietnamese perspective, Ho Chi Minh was the leader. They were thrilled to get rid of the French. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh, from what I understand, was actually, you know, pretty much digging the United States and hoping the United States was going to recognize Vietnam and, you know, be its ally in a sense. Maybe not, but he certainly didn't want to go to war with the United States. But from the United States perspective, we see the leaving of the French as an open gate to communism. North Vietnam, which kind of had some Soviet influences, maybe dating back to Yalta and the separation of Europe and the rest of the world into spheres of influence, definitely had a communist twinge to it. So that's what we see. That's all that we see. We don't see the colonial aspect of it. We don't see what it looks like as the French are leaving and the United States are entering. You know, if you are one of the Vietnamese, you can almost see yourself cheering as the French leave. We're free, we're free, we're free. And then dig that, there's some guy from America to save you from communism. You don't hear that. You see imperialist, colonial aggressor. And I'm not saying that was our intentions. You know, no bias. We're just trying to see the event through each, you know, side so we can understand what occurred. And I think that, you know, right or wrong, I don't know who's right or who's wrong. I think that's pretty factual. That the Vietnamese population, much of the poorer population, saw this Vietnam War as a war of independence, when the United States saw it as a war of containment against communism. So all throughout the 50s, 56, 57, 58, 59, into the early 60s, the United States acted only as an advisor to South Vietnam. South Vietnam was run first by a man by the name of Diem, and he was a Catholic in a Buddhist country. He was a little bit of a dictator, not a lot of democracy, not a lot of rights, but we supported that government because that, to us, represented containment of communism. That was our sphere of influence. So we couldn't make them democratic, but we did think that it was a better alternative to communism. So by building their army up, the hope was that we could stop that spreading of communism south. Ho Chi Minh became a communist. And he built trails all over North Vietnam leading into South Vietnam to arm that part of the population. Remember, North Vietnam doesn't see South Vietnam as another country. It's like North New York and South New York. It's all, New York. To him, there's one Vietnam. So he's running arms in his eyes to his comrades, to his allies, to his countrymen. We see him as the invader, as the communist aggressor, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to arm the communist rebels against the standing, government that we're supporting. So in 1960, I got to check my timer, guys. What do we got here? 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So in 1960, JFK was elected. There was a lot of controversy, another president involved with Vietnam, of what he really believed about Vietnam, but we can say at the least that he was hesitant about America's commitment to sending armies and, weapons and soldiers into the jungles of Southeast Asia. I've heard tapes where him and Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, were talking about how the hell do we get out? How do we save face and how do we get out? Doesn't matter. 1963, November 22nd, JFK is assassinated, and his successor is a man by the name of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, and he's a different kind of Democrat. Not in domestic policy, he's also a believer in civil rights and welfare programs and social, welfare nets. But in terms of foreign policy, he's much more of a cold man, cold warrior. Maybe not man, cold warrior. Cold man warrior? Needless to say, he believes in the domino theory with all of his heart and with all of his mind. So basically, he really wanted to save South Vietnam. And then there's an episode in 1964 called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I'm going to say that again. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So I look at my timer again. Where does the time go, my friends? 3 minutes. So the Gulf of Tonkin was an incident in North Vietnam in the coast where we claimed that North Vietnam attacked one of our ships, the U.S. Maddox, I believe it was. That, and there's trouble in that story. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. It's not a Pearl Harbor, though. But that's what we make it out to be. We make it out to be, this is an act of aggression. We're going to respond with force. And Lyndon Johnson goes to Congress. He said, I'm not going to escalate the war without permission from Congress. He doesn't get a war declaration, but he does get the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. We call it the blank check because Congress gives financial oversight over to the president. And now the president can go to town. Some quick vocabulary. You should know what Rolling Thunder is. That's the bombing program that decimated Vietnam. We dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than all of the bombs in the European theater of World War II on that little tiny country. We killed over 2.5, some say 3 million Vietnamese. They killed 54,000 Americans, and they won. So that war endlessly dragged through 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, all the way into the late 60s, until really America started turning against the war. Not all Americans. Still, the silent majority was probably supportive of the troops and the war and the effort and containment. But a large segment of the younger population started protesting. And things started coming out. My Lai massacre, these awful pictures of civilians that were massacred by U.S. soldiers. Agent Orange, which was a chemical used to strip the leaves in Vietnam that had terrible effects on the population and on our own soldiers. And just the idea that we weren't winning. So eventually, Lyndon Johnson doesn't run again. Richard Nixon wins. And Nixon promises a way out of Vietnam. Into 1972, we're still kind of there fighting pretty hard. But he begins a program called Vietnamization. Say it with me, children. As I look at my timer. We're dead. 1 minute. Vietnamization. That's on the test all the time. Vietnamization means we're going to turn the war over to Vietnam. It's the Iraqification idea that we're doing now in Iraq. As they stand up, say it with me, what do? We stand down. Vietnamization fails. Ultimately, Vietnam is lost. It's lost because as soon as we leave, Saigon falls and Vietnam becomes a communist country and containment failed. The lessons of Vietnam, really quick, I can't believe we're doing this in 40 seconds. Hesitant about sending troops elsewhere in the world. Not getting bogged down in another third world action. And the idea that it's just not might and strength, that you need to win the hearts and minds of the people. The last thing that we need to do is take that power back to Congress. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution? We gave the president unlimited financial support for the war. We have to take that back. The War Powers Act of 1973 did that. Congress has the power to remove troops 60 days after the president orders the troops out into combat. This gives the power back to Congress. Not to declare war, they've always held that, but to hold those financial strings and to make sure that we don't have another Vietnam.